Bellatrix Lestrange's story begins long before she ever raised her wand in defiance of the wizarding world, long before her name became whispered in fear. To understand her path, one must look back to the house she was born into, the ancient and powerful House of Black. The Black family was one of the most famous pure-blood wizarding dynasties in Britain, renowned for their wealth, their elegance, and above all, their obsession with blood purity. The Blacks prided themselves on being the noble and most ancient House of Black, a family whose branches reached into nearly every prominent wizarding line. From their lofty perspective, mingling with muggles or even marrying muggle-born witches and wizards was an unforgivable disgrace. Children were raised on tales of superiority, trained to believe they carried not only magic in their veins but destiny. Into this world Bellatrix was born. The exact date mattered little to her family, but her birth in the early 1950s secured another heir to the ideals of the Blacks. She was the eldest of 3 daughters, followed by Andromeda and Narcissa. From the very beginning, Bellatrix carried herself differently. Where Narcissa was quiet and polished, where Andromeda showed streaks of independence and warmth, Bellatrix burned with intensity. Her eyes seemed too sharp, too eager, as though even in infancy she strained towards something more powerful than the comfort of her crib. Her parents, Cygnus Black III and Druella Rosier, encouraged that hunger. Druella came from the equally proud Rosier family, and together they poured into their daughters every prejudice, every expectation, every lecture about what it meant to be pure blood and noble. The home where Bellatrix grew up was filled with echoes of pride. Portraits of solemn ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following the children with a stern, unyielding gaze. Some sneered if they caught a daughter playing too childishly. Others nodded approvingly when Bellatrix repeated lines about the inferiority of muggles, or when she corrected a younger cousin who dared to question tradition. Even play in that house was not free of ideology. When other children built castles out of blocks, Bellatrix imagined fortresses to keep the unworthy out. When others played with dolls, she pretended hers were rulers commanding armies. The air of the Black home was not simply nurturing, it was indoctrinating. Bellatrix quickly grew into a child who idolized her ancestors. She would stand before the family tapestry that traced bloodlines back for centuries, reading the names of those still honored, those scorched away for betrayal. The tapestry was more than decoration. It was a warning. To be disowned meant more than losing a name. It meant obliteration from memory. Bellatrix would stare at the burned spots where traitors' names once appeared and promise herself, in whispers, that she would never fail the family. Loyalty to blood was loyalty to self. For her, there was no separation between identity and lineage. Her relationship with her sisters shaped her early years as well. Andromeda was close to her in age, and the two often played together. But where Bellatrix gravitated toward power and dominance, Andromeda leaned toward compassion. She enjoyed caring for magical creatures or sneaking glimpses at Muggle culture, though she kept such interests hidden. Bellatrix, even as a child, scorned her sister's softer heart. She called it weakness, though at times she seemed more irritated than cruel, as if baffled that anyone raised in their house could see the world differently. Narcissa, the youngest, admired Bellatrix fiercely. She followed her around, watched her practice wand movements with sticks in the garden, and copied the tilt of her chin. Bellatrix relished the role of leader among them, shaping Narcissa's admiration into obedience. The extended Black family provided other influences. Cousins like Sirius and Regulus would later play their parts in history, but in childhood they were simply names on the tapestry, children who occasionally visited. Bellatrix was older than Sirius, but even then she noticed his rebellious streak, his tendency to question their family's rules. To her, this was a personal affront. How could a black, raised with such care, spit on the very ideals that defined them? That sense of betrayal simmered in her, though she rarely confronted him directly as a child. Regulus, on the other hand, was more pliable, more loyal, and Bellatrix approved of him. She marked him in her mind as a cousin who understood duty. Her father Cygnus was not a warm man, but he was proud. He instilled in Bellatrix a sense that her destiny was tied to the greatness of their name. He spoke often of the need for vigilance, warning his daughters that the wizarding world was changing, that upstart Muggle-borns were diluting tradition. Bellatrix listened intently, her eyes alight, while her sisters fidgeted or nodded dutifully. To her, these warnings were thrilling, promises that a grand struggle lay ahead. Her mother, Druella, reinforced these views but added refinement. She taught Bellatrix the importance of elegance, of bearing oneself like royalty. Druella believed that pure-blood witches should not only be powerful, but also untouchable in grace. Bellatrix absorbed both lessons, from her father, zealotry, from her mother, poise. Together they became a dangerous combination. As Bellatrix grew, her magic began to show itself early and with ferocity. Some children levitated toys or changed hair color by accident. Bellatrix set things alight when she was angry. She blasted apart doors when frustrated. Once, in a fit of rage at Andromeda for refusing to play her chosen game, she sent a vase crashing against the wall without touching it. Rather than scold her, her parents praised the display of strength. To them, Bellatrix's wild energy was not something to temper but something to harness. Each time she demonstrated her power, she felt herself rise higher in their estimation, and that approval became intoxicating. She began to equate love with dominance, worth with destruction. By the time she was 10, Bellatrix had already begun to think of herself as superior to others. She looked down on neighbors, on shopkeepers in Diagon Alley, on anyone who could not trace their bloodline to noble families. She absorbed every prejudice spoken in her household until it became her instinct. If she saw a family laughing together who lacked the right heritage, she scoffed. If she heard of a student excelling who came from Muggle parents, she sneered. It was not only belief, it was identity. To Bellatrix, to be a black meant to be above. Her fascination with the darker corners of magic also began in these years. While other children might have been content with harmless charms, Bellatrix was curious about spells whispered of but not taught. She would sneak into corners of the family library, where older tomes rested, trying to puzzle out runes and incantations too advanced for her. The shadows of curses called to her, not because she understood their consequences, but because they promised power. To wield a curse was to control, and control was all she craved. Though her parents discouraged open dabbling in the dark arts at her age, they did little to dissuade her curiosity. In truth, they saw in her a flame that aligned perfectly with their values. Her name itself carried weight. Bellatrix, Latin for female warrior, a star in the constellation Orion. Her family named her with intention, binding her identity to power and legacy even before she could speak, and she grew into that name with every passing year. To be a warrior, to fight for the honor of her bloodline, became her purpose before she even stepped into Hogwarts. When she traced the constellation in books, she thought of herself as one of those stars distant, untouchable, burning fiercely in the sky. The black family gatherings further shaped her resolve. At large dinners, she heard relatives discuss politics and the threat of integration. She listened to stories of ancient triumphs, of how their family once dominated magical society. Bellatrix absorbed these tales as scripture. When older cousins scoffed or whispered dissent, she bristled. To her there was no room for doubt. Doubt was betrayal. She was young, but her convictions already outpaced her years. Every story she heard of Muggle inferiority, every warning of decay, solidified in her mind as absolute truth. The cultural climate of the wizarding world at the time added fuel to her beliefs. The mid-20th century saw increasing debates over blood status, over whether Muggle-borns deserved equal rights. To some, these were progressive steps. To Bellatrix, they were signs of decay, proof that her family's warnings were coming true. Even before she had the language to express it fully, she felt the pull of a cause. She would not only inherit her family's pride, she would defend it. The relationship between the sisters became more strained as they grew older. Andromeda's kindness, once a mild irritation, began to look like defiance. Narcissa's admiration remained, but Bellatrix's need for control sometimes pushed her too far, turning affection into dominance. Still, the three were bound by blood and by the shared weight of expectation. They were young, but already their paths diverged, paths that would eventually split them apart forever. As her 11th birthday approached, Bellatrix grew restless. She longed for Hogwarts not as a place of learning, but as a stage. She wanted to prove herself, to show that her power outstripped her peers, that her blood made her destined for greatness. The letter from Hogwarts, when it arrived, was no surprise but a coronation. She held it in her hands with satisfaction, knowing it was merely the next step in the destiny she had already claimed for herself. Bellatrix Lestrange was not yet Lestrange, not yet a Death Eater, not yet a murderer. She was simply a girl of the noble and most ancient House of Black, but already the seeds had been planted, seeds of arrogance, of obsession, of hunger for power, seeds watered by prejudice and pride, seeds that would grow into something terrible, something unforgettable. Her story had only just begun, but the path was already set, carved by the roots of darkness she was born into. When Bellatrix Black arrived at Hogwarts, the castle welcomed her with the same ancient grandeur that had greeted generations before her. The towering walls, the shifting staircases, the echoing corridors, each stone seemed to hum with history. For many young witches and wizards, stepping into the great hall for the first time was overwhelming. For Bellatrix, it was confirmation. She walked with her head held high, her dark hair framing sharp features, her eyes scanning the enchanted ceiling as if daring the stars themselves to look away. She belonged here, not as a student, uncertain of her place, but as one who carried the weight of legacy in every stride. The Sorting Hat did not hesitate. Placed upon her head, it whispered only briefly of her ambition, her hunger, her cunning. Though it might have considered Ravenclaw for her brilliance, or even Gryffindor for her fearlessness, the hat sensed the deeper current within her, loyalty to blood, devotion to power, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for both. Slytherin, it declared, almost instantly, and Bellatrix smiled as though she had received a crown. She had never doubted where she belonged, and now it was official. She was among her own. Slytherin House in those years was a den of ambition and tradition. The walls of the dungeons were lined with green light that shimmered off the black lake outside, casting rippling patterns across the stones. To Bellatrix, the common room was not gloomy but regal. The silver and green, the serpent motifs, The hushed voices, plotting futures, all of it suited her perfectly. She made friends quickly, gravitating toward those who shared her beliefs, her scorn for lesser blood, her hunger for recognition. Among Slytherins, she found not only acceptance but a stage for her intensity. In classes, Bellatrix distinguished herself with talent and ferocity. Charms came easily to her. She flicked her wand with confidence, producing results sharper and stronger than her peers. In Transfiguration, she impressed even stern professors with her precision. Potions intrigued her with their balance of delicacy and danger, and she relished the careful stirring, the precise cuts of ingredients, the way a single mistake could turn beauty into disaster. But it was defense against the dark arts that captured her most fully. Spells of shielding, of stunning, of counter curses. These were not merely lessons to her, but glimpses into a battlefield she longed to stand upon. When other students practiced half-heartedly, Bellatrix attacked her targets with zeal, her wand crackling with energy, her eyes lit with something bordering on delight. Her professors recognized her intelligence, though not always with admiration. Some praised her skill and discipline. Others worried about the intensity in her gaze, the relish with which she performed aggressive spells. In staff meetings, her name was spoken with a mixture of respect and unease. She was brilliant, yes, but also volatile. Yet as long as she obeyed rules in class, little could be done beyond acknowledging her as a student of remarkable potential. Her reputation among students grew quickly. To her housemates, she was a leader, bold and charismatic. To those outside Slytherin, she was intimidating, even frightening. She walked the corridors with confidence, her laughter sharp, her comments cutting. Gryffindors in particular drew her ire, their talk of bravery and fairness grating against her belief in superiority. She enjoyed provoking them, making remarks about blood status, watching their faces flush with anger. For Bellatrix, every confrontation was a small victory, a reinforcement of her own strength. Friendships in Hogwarts often shaped futures, and Bellatrix's circle was no exception. She gravitated toward those who admired her intensity and who shared her disdain for weakness. Among her closest allies were future Death Eaters, students who would, like her, be drawn to the rising figure of Lord Voldemort. They gathered in corners of the common room, whispering of pure blood glory, of the need to reclaim wizarding society from what they saw as corruption. To others, these were idle boasts of ambitious children. To Bellatrix, they were promises. Her sister's presence at Hogwarts added further layers to her life. Andromeda, only a year younger, was sorted into Slytherin as well, though she never shared Bellatrix's fervor. At first, the sisters were close, studying together, walking the halls side by side. But cracks appeared as Andromeda revealed a softer view of the world. She treated Muggle-born classmates with kindness, spoke with those Bellatrix scorned, questioned the harshness of family beliefs. To Bellatrix, this was betrayal. She scolded Andromeda, tried to correct her, mocked her choices, but the rift only grew. What began as annoyance hardened into contempt, a gulf that would widen until Andromeda was burned from the family tapestry. Narcissa, the youngest, adored Bellatrix throughout her Hogwarts years. Though several years behind, she looked up to her eldest sister as a model of strength and elegance. Bellatrix nurtured that admiration, shaping Narcissa's worldview, ensuring that the youngest black sister remained loyal to tradition. She taught Narcissa how to sneer at mudbloods, how to carry herself with confidence, how to wield cruelty as casually as charm. In this, Bellatrix found satisfaction. For where Andromeda disappointed her, Narcissa seemed to confirm her teachings. The larger social life of Hogwarts offered more opportunities for Bellatrix to assert herself. Quidditch matches stirred her house pride into frenzy. She cheered loudly for Slytherin, jeering at opposing teams with a ferocity that bordered on violent. In the Great Hall, she commanded attention at her table, telling stories with flair, mocking enemies with biting wit. To some, she was magnetic. To others, she was terrifying, but no one could ignore her. Her fascination with darker magic deepened during these years. The restricted section of the library called to her, its shelves filled with tomes whispering of curses, hexes, and forbidden practices. Though students were not permitted to access such knowledge freely, Bellatrix found ways through charm, through persistence, through allies who knew how to bend rules. She studied curses with a hunger that exceeded mere curiosity. She wanted to master them, to feel their power thrumming at her fingertips. While other students practiced jinxes for duels, Bellatrix whispered incantations that made shadows curl and sparks flare ominously. Dueling became one of her passions. In the controlled setting of the dueling club, she shone. Her spells were fast, precise, often overwhelming opponents before they could react. She relished the applause when she disarmed a rival, the gasps when she cast with unusual force. But beyond the club, she sought duels in secret, matches where rules were looser and the stakes higher. She wanted not only victory but dominance, the sight of an opponent cowering under her wand. To her, dueling was not sport, but preparation. As the years passed, Bellatrix's reputation solidified. Teachers saw her brilliance, her peers felt her presence, and her family watched with pride. She was becoming exactly what they hoped, a strong, devoted daughter of the Black Line. Yet beneath the surface, something else stirred. Rumors whispered through the Slytherin common room of a young wizard rising beyond the school's walls. A man named Tom Riddle, brilliant, charming, and dangerous, was said to be gathering followers. By Bellatrix's later years at Hogwarts, the whispers had grown louder. Riddle, now calling himself Lord Voldemort, spoke of a new order, a return to pure blood dominance, a war against the dilution of wizarding society. When Bellatrix heard these stories, her heart quickened. Here, perhaps, was the figure she had been waiting for, the leader worthy of her devotion. She had always believed in the cause, but causes needed champions. Voldemort was more than a champion, he was a vision, a promise of power incarnate. Though she did not meet him until after graduation, the very mention of his name lit a fire within her. She imagined standing at his side, her wand raised in loyalty, her destiny fulfilled. In her final years at Hogwarts, Bellatrix perfected her skills. She left no doubt of her talent, her ambition, her zeal. She was not content with being one of many. She sought to stand out, to be remembered. Her essays were sharp, her spell work flawless, her presence commanding. She graduated not only with strong marks, but with a reputation as one of the fiercest witches of her generation. Yet Hogwarts, for all its history and grandeur, was only the beginning. For Bellatrix, school was not the peak of her life, but the prologue. It was the stage upon which she sharpened her claws, tested her power, and confirmed her beliefs. Beyond its walls waited the wider world, filled with enemies to conquer and a dark lord to serve. She stepped out of the castle not as a girl of the Black family, but as a woman ready to carve her name in fear. The halls she left behind would remember her differently. Some would recall her brilliance, her elegance, her sheer skill. Others would remember her cruelty, the way she sneered at weakness and relished superiority. But all would remember her, for Bellatrix Black had never allowed herself to be invisible. She carried with her the lessons of Hogwarts, twisted into a blade sharper than most could wield. And with that blade, she would cut her way into history. For now, though, as she stood on the cusp of adulthood, she was still only Bellatrix Black, beautiful, brilliant, and burning with the hunger for power. She had not yet taken the name Lestrange. She had not yet raised her wand to kill. But already, the darkness that rooted her childhood had grown tall, casting shadows that stretched far beyond the castle grounds. Bellatrix Black left Hogwarts, with her head high and her eyes fixed firmly on the future. The castle had sharpened her mind, refined her magic, and tested her ambitions, but she had never intended to remain merely a gifted witch. For her, school was preparation, a rehearsal before the grand stage of the world, and in that world she longed for a leader, a cause, a destiny larger than herself. The whispers she had heard in Slytherin's common room about the rising wizard, once known as Tom Riddle, lingered in her imagination long after graduation. She had not yet met him, but already she felt the pull of his vision. The wizarding world of the 1970s was restless. Old traditions clashed with new ideas, and the divide between pure-blood supremacists and progressives deepened with every year. Muggle-born witches and wizards rose to prominence, their talent undeniable, their presence a challenge to those who clung to bloodline as the only true measure of worth. For families like the Blacks, it was a time of fear and outrage. They saw the world slipping away from their grasp, their ancient privileges eroding. Bellatrix, raised in the heart of such ideology, could not bear the thought of decline. She did not want to live in a world where her name meant less, where her blood did not command respect. It was in this climate that Voldemort's presence grew stronger. To Bellatrix, he was not simply another dark wizard. He was a visionary. Stories painted him as brilliant, persuasive, and merciless, a man who would not only restore the old order but build a new one, where power ruled, where blood purity was sacred, and where those like her could ascend to greatness. When she finally heard his voice for the first time at a secret gathering, the effect was intoxicating. Voldemort spoke with eloquence that seemed carved from fire. He painted pictures of a world cleansed of weakness, of a society where the strong ruled without apology. His words stirred in Bellatrix every belief her family had instilled, but sharper, grander, more absolute. Where her parents had warned of decline, Voldemort promised conquest. Where her professors had restrained her brilliance within rules, Voldemort promised liberation. She listened, entranced, as though hearing the voice of fate itself. By the time he finished, Bellatrix was not merely convinced, she was devoted. Her initiation into the circle of his followers came quickly. She was not timid or hesitant. She offered herself eagerly, with zeal that bordered on reverence. For her, Voldemort was more than a leader. He was a cause incarnate, the embodiment of every value she had been taught to cherish. To serve him was not a burden, but an honor, a destiny fulfilled. When the dark mark was seared into her arm, Bellatrix bore the pain with pride. She admired the way the inked skull and serpent twisted upon her pale skin, not as a brand but as a crown. Alongside her, others swore allegiance, men and women of old families, ambitious youths, hungry for power, disillusioned witches, and wizards who longed for order. Among them were Rodolphus Lestrange and his brother Robestan, members of another pure-blood house, Rodolphus had been her husband by arrangement, a union made to preserve bloodlines rather than out of affection. Bellatrix accepted the marriage with the same cold logic that had shaped her upbringing. She respected Rodolphus as a fellow believer, a comrade in the cause. But love, tenderness, or devotion between them never blossomed. Her true passion, her true loyalty, belonged elsewhere to Voldemort. Her early missions as a Death Eater thrilled her. At first, they were small acts, intimidation, threats, the silencing of those who opposed the movement. But Bellatrix performed each task with ferocity, never shrinking from cruelty. Where others hesitated, she pressed forward. Where others faltered, she seemed to glow with exhilaration. She relished the fear in her victim's eyes, the knowledge that her wand commanded obedience. Every scream she drew from an enemy felt like proof of her superiority. Every act of violence felt like communion with the cause. Soon, her reputation grew. Among Death Eaters, she became known for her fearlessness, her skill, and her utter lack of mercy. Among enemies, her name inspired dread. She carried herself with elegance even in battle, her laughter ringing through the air as spells clashed. She delighted in duels, in testing her magic against others, in proving again and again that she was unmatched. It was not enough for her to win. She wanted to dominate, to humiliate, to crush the spirit of those who opposed her. Her family watched with mixed emotions. Narcissa admired her, as always, seeing in Bellatrix the fulfillment of everything their upbringing had promised. Andromeda, however, grew horrified. She had already distanced herself from the family's rigid beliefs, falling in love with a muggle-born wizard named Ted Tonks. To Bellatrix, this was treason. When Andromeda married him, the Black family struck her from the family tree, burning her name from the tapestry. Bellatrix rejoiced in the act, sneering that her sister had chosen filth over destiny. From that day on, Andromeda was dead to her, not simply estranged, but despised. In Bellatrix's mind, only loyalty to blood and to the Dark Lord mattered. Love, compassion, and choice were weaknesses she scorned. Her bond with Narcissa, meanwhile, deepened. Narcissa married Lucius Malfoy, another pure-blood supremacist whose wealth and influence bolstered the Death Eater's cause. Bellatrix approved, not because she admired Lucius, but because the match strengthened their shared ideals. The Black sisters, now tied to both the Lestrange and Malfoy families, formed a triad of power that positioned them at the heart of Voldemort's movement. Bellatrix, Narcissa, and their husbands became pillars of his new order, ready to carry out his will without hesitation. Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort surpassed mere loyalty. It became obsession. She spoke of him with reverence, her eyes shining whenever his name passed her lips. She watched him with adoration, hung on his every word, and sought constantly to prove herself worthy of his notice. Some whispered that her devotion was love, twisted and feverish. Others thought it was worship, a faith that consumed her more completely than religion. Whatever its nature, it defined her. Rodolphus was her husband in name, but Voldemort was her heart, her God, her reason. Her zealotry sometimes clashed with other Death Eaters. She despised those she considered lukewarm in their loyalty, mocking them for cowardice. Lucius Malfoy, for all his power, often drew her scorn. To Bellatrix, his pragmatism, his concern for wealth and reputation, revealed weakness. She believed loyalty must be absolute, unshaken even by danger. For her, hesitation was betrayal. This fanaticism made her both admired and feared within Voldemort's ranks. She was the Dark Lord's fiercest servant, and none doubted she would kill even her own kin if commanded. The first real war tested her devotion further. Voldemort's followers began launching open attacks, spreading fear across Britain. Bellatrix relished the chaos. Villages fell silent after Death Eater raids. Families disappeared. Ministry officials vanished in the night. Bellatrix moved through it all like a shadow of fire, leaving devastation in her wake. Her skill in the dark arts, honed beyond anything taught at Hogwarts, set her apart. She mastered the Cruciatus Curse, wielding it with terrifying ease. Where others faltered at causing such agony, she reveled in it. To her, the curse was not merely a weapon. It was a form of expression, a way to carve loyalty, fear, and despair into the hearts of enemies. Through it all, her faith in Voldemort never wavered. Even when the Ministry fought back, even when battles turned dangerous, she followed him with blind devotion. In every duel, she imagined herself his hand, his instrument, his chosen. She saw her life not as her own, but as a vessel for his will. Her laughter echoed in the darkness of raids, a chilling sound that haunted survivors. For Bellatrix, cruelty was not a byproduct of war, it was a celebration of power, a ritual of devotion to her master. Yet even as her star rose, shadows of the future crept closer. Voldemort's ambitions grew bolder, his actions riskier. The Ministry fought harder, the Order of the Phoenix rose in defiance, and whispers of resistance spread. Bellatrix, however, never doubted. Where others began to fear, she only burned brighter. For her, doubt did not exist. Voldemort would triumph, his enemies would fall, and she would stand at his side, forever loyal, forever his. The First Wizarding War spread like a storm across Britain, and for Bellatrix Lestrange it was the fulfillment of everything she had ever longed for. Where others saw terror, she saw opportunity. Where others felt dread, she felt exhilaration. At last the whispers of superiority, the lessons of her childhood, and the devotion she had pledged to the Dark Lord were no longer words but action. She was no longer just Bellatrix Black, daughter of the House of Black, or even Bellatrix Lestrange, wife of Rodolphus. She was a weapon sharpened by belief, unleashed upon the world in Voldemort's name. The war began slowly, with disappearances and small attacks, but soon it swelled into an open struggle. Villages were attacked under cover of night. Families were found lifeless in their homes, and the mark of the skull and serpent burned green against the sky above fallen victims. Bellatrix moved through these missions with grace and savagery, her wand quick, her spells merciless. She relished every assignment Voldemort gave her, treating each one as a chance to prove her devotion. When others hesitated, she was the first to strike. When others faltered, she was the last to retreat. Her laughter often rang through the chaos of battle, chilling even her comrades, for it was the laughter of one who delighted in cruelty. Her skill in the dark arts made her stand apart even among Death Eaters. She mastered curses with precision, her duels filled with elegance as well as ferocity. The Cruciatus Curse, in particular, became her signature. While many could cast it, few could sustain it with the intensity Bellatrix managed. She poured not only magic but herself into it, channeling her obsession with dominance and her devotion to Voldemort into the spell. For her, the screams of her victims were music, proof of her superiority, a hymn to her master. Survivors spoke of her eyes alight with frenzy as she tortured them, of her voice rising in laughter as pain racked their bodies. To face Bellatrix was not merely to face an enemy, it was to face someone who reveled in suffering. In these years, her marriage to Rodolphus Lestrange receded further into formality. Though bound by family duty, there was little tenderness between them. Rodolphus shared her beliefs and her devotion to Voldemort, but he could never claim her heart. Bellatrix's true loyalty lay with her master, and all else was secondary. Still, she and Rodolphus, along with his brother Robistan, formed a formidable trio of Death Eaters. Together they executed raids, captured enemies, and spread fear. The Lestrange name became entwined with terror, a family synonymous with fanaticism. Bellatrix's family ties also colored her role in the war. Narcissa and Lucius Malfoy provided influence and resources, though Bellatrix often scorned Lucius's cautious approach. She saw his pragmatism as weakness, his careful political maneuvering as cowardice compared to her own unflinching zeal. Andromeda, by then disowned, was despised as a traitor. Her daughter, Nymphadora Tonks, would one day join the Order of the Phoenix, deepening Bellatrix's hatred. To Bellatrix, the war was not only about ideology, it was personal. Every relative who betrayed the purity of their bloodline became an enemy as deserving of destruction as any Auror. As the war escalated, the Ministry of Magic fought desperately to contain the chaos. Aurors patrolled more fiercely, laws tightened, and the Order of the Phoenix rose to confront Voldemort directly. Bellatrix faced these enemies with relish. She dueled Aurors with unflinching confidence, often overwhelming even seasoned fighters. Her reputation grew with every confrontation. To the wizarding public, her name became synonymous with terror. Mothers warned children of her, newspapers printed her crimes in bold, and whispers of her cruelty spread faster than fire. For Bellatrix, such fear was not shame but triumph. Her encounters with members of the Order were frequent and intense. She crossed wands with Frank and Alice Longbottom, fierce Aurors who fought with determination. She faced Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose calm precision made him a worthy opponent. She even dueled members of the Prewitt family, whose bravery cost them their lives. Each battle was a test, and Bellatrix relished them. Win or lose, she gloried in the clash, the heat of spells, the surge of adrenaline. She lived for battle as others lived for air. Voldemort's inner circle valued her loyalty. Unlike some who feared his wrath, Bellatrix welcomed his gaze. She basked in his attention, thrilled when he acknowledged her. She never questioned his decisions, never wavered in her faith. Where others sought personal gain or protection, she sought only to serve. Her fanaticism made her dangerous, not only to enemies, but to allies. More than once, she mocked those she deemed cowardly, her scorn cutting deep, yet Voldemort seemed to tolerate, even appreciate, her zeal. She was, in many ways, his truest believer. The war, however, did not unfold as Bellatrix imagined. Though the Death Eaters spread terror, resistance remained strong. The Order of the Phoenix grew bolder, striking back with daring raids and relentless defense. The Ministry, though often faltering, did not collapse. Most of all, a prophecy began to circulate, a prophecy that spoke of a child destined to defeat the Dark Lord. Bellatrix paid little attention to such rumors at first, dismissing them as foolish superstition, but Voldemort listened, and his obsession with the prophecy would lead to the beginning of his downfall. When Voldemort went to Godric's Hollow to kill the infant Harry Potter, Bellatrix was not there. She might have begged to accompany him, but the Dark Lord moved in secrecy, trusting no one fully. That night changed everything. Instead of triumph, Voldemort vanished, his body destroyed by the curse he cast. For Bellatrix, the news was unthinkable. Others panicked, fled, or claimed they had been bewitched. Some renounced him to save themselves, but not Bellatrix. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. She refused to believe her master was gone. To her, the Dark Lord was eternal, beyond defeat. She railed against fellow Death Eaters who abandoned him, calling them cowards and traitors. She declared, with fire in her eyes, that he would return, that he would rise again, and that she would wait for him, no matter how long it took. Her loyalty did not diminish with his absence, it intensified. Without him, she was restless, her devotion like a fire without air. She longed for orders, for purpose, for his voice. But the ministry moved quickly. Death Eaters were hunted down, trials held, and Azkaban filled with prisoners. Bellatrix did not run. Alongside Rodolphus, Rabastan, and Barty Crouch Jr., she struck one final blow, capturing the Aurors Frank and Alice Longbottom. In a frenzy of devotion, she tortured them with the Cruciatus Curse, demanding information about Voldemort's fate. Her cruelty left them broken, their minds shattered beyond repair. It was one of the most infamous acts of the war, a testament to her madness and her loyalty. Her arrest followed swiftly. Dragged before the Wizengamot, she stood not as a prisoner begging for mercy, but as a zealot unbroken. While others pleaded innocence, claiming they had been forced, Bellatrix raised her head proudly. She declared that her master would return, that his enemies would fall, and that she would rise again at his side. Her voice rang with certainty, defiant even as chains bound her. To many, she seemed deranged, but to her, it was truth. Sentenced to Azkaban for life, she walked into the prison with her head held high. Dementors closed in, their presence suffocating, but Bellatrix did not cower. She carried within her the memory of Voldemort, and that memory shielded her from despair. Where others withered under the Dementor's gaze, Bellatrix endured. Her devotion was armor, her madness a shield. She would wait in the cold, in the darkness, in the endless misery, because she believed her master would return, and when he did, she would be ready. Thus ended the First Wizarding War, but for Bellatrix Lestrange, it was not an ending. It was a pause, a silence before the storm would rise again. Azkaban rose from the sea like a wound upon the horizon, a fortress of despair where hope went to die. For most who entered its walls, life ended not with death, but with the slow unraveling of the mind. The Dementors, cloaked in shadows, glided along the corridors, their chill seeping into every stone, into every prisoner's bones, stripping away joy and memory until only emptiness remained. For many, Azkaban was a place worse than death. For Bellatrix Lestrange, it was merely another battlefield. When she was cast into her cell after the trial, chains heavy upon her wrists, Bellatrix did not bow her head. She sat upright, silver eyes blazing, her dark hair wild about her face. The cries of other prisoners echoed faintly through the stone, some pleading, some cursing, some weeping. Bellatrix did none of these things. Instead, she whispered one name over and over again, her master's. To her, the sentence was not defeat, but devotion. She had declared in the courtroom that Voldemort would return, and she meant every word. If she had to wait a lifetime in chains, she would wait gladly. The years that followed blurred for most prisoners. For Bellatrix, they sharpened. The Dementors pressed against her, draining warmth, stealing happiness. But Bellatrix clung to the one memory they could not take, Voldemort's presence, his voice, his promises. She replayed every moment she had spent in his service, every word he had spoken, every mission she had carried out. Where other inmates crumbled beneath despair, Bellatrix kept herself whole by weaving her devotion into a shield. She believed utterly, and belief became her survival. She fed on her hatred, too. Hatred for the Aurors who had arrested her, for the Longbottoms whose screams still echoed sweetly in her memory, for her sister Andromeda, for every traitor who had renounced the Dark Lord. Hatred kept her warm in the icy dark. She whispered curses into the silence, practicing incantations in her mind until the words became a litany. Her wand had been taken from her, but the spells still lived within her. In her imagination she cast them again and again, picturing her enemies writhing, her laughter ringing above their cries. Her fellow Death Eaters suffered around her. Some grew silent, broken by Dementor's relentless presence. Some raved, their minds shattered. Bellatrix did not pity them. She sneered at their weakness, convinced that their failure to endure revealed their lack of true loyalty. In her mind, only she bore the mark of the Dark Lord faithfully. Only she held his memory tightly enough to withstand the storm. This belief hardened into pride. Even imprisoned, she saw herself as chosen. Time in Azkaban did not soften her edges. It sharpened them. Her body grew frailer, her hair tangled, her skin pale from the absence of sunlight. But her eyes burned brighter, her fanaticism intensified. If she was gaunt, she considered it a badge of endurance. If her voice grew hoarse from screaming into the darkness, it only proved her strength. For her, Azkaban was not punishment, but proof. Proof that she could endure anything for her master. Proof that her loyalty could never be broken. Occasionally she heard whispers from the guards, rumors carried by voices who thought the prisoners too lost to listen. Voldemort was gone, they said. The Dark Lord had perished at the hand of a child. He would never return. Each time she heard such talk, Bellatrix laughed, a sound that startled even the hardened guards. She laughed because she knew better. She laughed because their doubt was weakness, and her faith was absolute. She laughed until the sound echoed down the corridors, chilling both prisoners and wardens. Her fellow Lestranges Rodolphus and Rabastan shared her cell block. Though she did not love Rodolphus, their bond of ideology remained. They muttered together in the dark, plotting what they would do when the Dark Lord returned. Even in Azkaban's silence, they dreamed of vengeance. Yet Bellatrix dominated even among them, her intensity eclipsing theirs. Where they sometimes sagged under despair, she burned like a torch. She became a kind of dark prophet among the prisoners, a reminder that Voldemort's shadow still lingered. Years passed. Bellatrix lost track of time. Seasons outside meant nothing within stone walls. Her world was narrow. Stone, chains, dementors. Yet in her mind, it was vast. She saw the Dark Lord's triumph, imagined the day he would stride into Azkaban and shatter its gates, imagined herself at his side again. That vision kept her alive. Others clung to scraps of memory. Bellatrix clung to prophecy, to certainty. And then, one night, the sea roared louder against the fortress walls, and the impossible happened. The Dark Lord returned. The breakout was chaos, but to Bellatrix it was deliverance. The Dementors, once jailers, now turned allies, answering to Voldemort's call. Their presence lifted, their chill redirected. Doors burst open, chains clattered to the ground, and prisoners staggered into the corridors, blinking at the sudden possibility of freedom. Bellatrix rose among them like a queen reclaiming her throne. Though frail and scarred by years of imprisonment, she moved with triumphant certainty. Her laughter rang through Azkaban once more, but now it was joyous, exultant. When she stood before Voldemort again, kneeling at his feet, her devotion burned brighter than ever. She pressed her lips to the hem of his robes, declaring through trembling voice and shining eyes that she had never wavered, never doubted, never ceased to believe. She begged him to test her loyalty, to let her prove that even years in chains could not break her faith. And Voldemort, who valued loyalty above all, accepted her back with satisfaction. She had endured, and in her endurance she had become even more his than before. The Azkaban years were behind her, but they had not diminished her. They had transformed her. She had been fanatical before, now she was unshakable. She had been cruel before, now she was merciless. She had loved her master before, now she worshipped him as though he were life itself. Azkaban had not broken Bellatrix Lestrange. It had forged her into steel. When Bellatrix Lestrange stepped once more into the world beyond Azkaban's walls, it was as though the air itself tasted different. The salt of the sea faded from her tongue, replaced by the thrill of freedom and the pulse of purpose. Though her body bore the marks of years in captivity, thin limbs, hollow cheeks, a voice hoarse from long hours in silence, her spirit was unbroken. In fact, it was fiercer than ever, sharpened by endurance, polished by devotion. She had endured where others had faltered. She had waited faithfully, and her waiting had been rewarded. Her master had returned, and she was his again. The reunion with Voldemort was not simply joyful, it was sacred. She approached him not as a servant greeting her lord, but as a worshipper approaching a god. She dropped to her knees, pressing her lips to the hem of his robes, her silver eyes gleaming with tears of relief and rapture. Her voice trembled as she proclaimed her loyalty, reminding him that she had never once doubted, that she had withstood the torment of Azkaban by clinging to his name. Others had betrayed him, denied him, or grown weak in his absence. She alone had remained unwavering, her heart a beacon of faith in the darkness. Voldemort's response was measured, but it carried with it a certain satisfaction. He valued loyalty above all, and Bellatrix had proven hers beyond question. He spoke to her with acknowledgment, granting her the place she craved most at his side, among his most trusted. In her heart, the moment was not merely vindication. It was the fulfillment of destiny. She was not simply Bellatrix Lestrange, freed from prison. She was Bellatrix, the Dark Lord's most devoted, the flame that would burn the world in his name. Among the Death Eaters, her return was both admired and resented. Many had avoided Azkaban by feigning innocence or by claiming they had been bewitched. Some had lived quietly, burying their allegiance under layers of caution. To Bellatrix, they were cowards. She scorned them openly, mocking their excuses, deriding their lack of faith. Lucius Malfoy, in particular, became the target of her sharp tongue. She sneered at his careful politicking, his obsession with wealth and status. He had avoided Azkaban, yes, but at the price of his pride. Bellatrix viewed him as weak, his loyalty compromised by self-preservation. In contrast, she and her fellow Lestranges wore their imprisonment like armor. Rodolphus and Rabastan had endured as she had, and though they lacked her fanaticism, their shared suffering set them apart. To Bellatrix, Azkaban was proof of their devotion, a mark of honor that elevated them above the rest. When she gathered with other Death Eaters in the flickering candlelight of Voldemort's meetings, She carried herself as one who had earned her place, unashamed, unbroken, and fiercely proud. The world outside Azkaban had changed in her absence, but Bellatrix adapted swiftly. She re-entered Voldemort's service with renewed hunger, eager to prove herself once more. Raids resumed, murders spread, and whispers of terror carried her name. Her wand, returned to her, felt like an extension of her soul. When she cast the Cruciatus Curse, it was with the precision of an artist, the fervor of a believer. She did not merely cause pain, she orchestrated it, savoring the cries, drinking in the fear. For her, every act of cruelty was not cruelty at all, but devotion, a hymn of magic to her master. Her relationship with Voldemort deepened in this second war. Others followed him out of fear, out of ambition, out of habit. Bellatrix followed him with worship. Her every glance, every word, carried an intensity that bordered on madness. She longed for his approval, hungered for his praise, and resented any who stood too close to him. Her devotion was not the tempered loyalty of a follower, but the fevered adoration of one who had given her entire being. To Bellatrix, Voldemort was not merely a man, he was destiny. This devotion often led her into conflict with other Death Eaters. Severus Snape, in particular, drew her suspicion. She distrusted his motives, his manner, his place within the Dark Lord's circle. Though Voldemort valued Snape's cunning and usefulness, Bellatrix could not reconcile his past with her vision of absolute loyalty. She accused him, questioned him, even challenged him. Her jealousy was clear. She could not bear to see anyone else receive the Dark Lord's favor. Yet Voldemort tolerated Snape, and so Bellatrix restrained her fury, though it seethed within her. Her family ties also played a role in this new chapter of war. Narcissa, her beloved sister, came to her in desperation, fearing for her son Draco, who had been tasked by Voldemort with a near impossible mission. Narcissa begged Bellatrix to help protect him, to use her influence, to shield him from failure. Bellatrix, though loyal to her sister, was torn. She cared for Narcissa, but her devotion to Voldemort overrode all else. To her, his will was law. If Draco failed, it was because he was unworthy. Yet when Narcissa insisted, they together sought Snape's oath, binding him to Draco's defense. Bellatrix seethed at involving Snape but relented for her sister's sake. The moment revealed her complexity, capable of love, yet never beyond the shadow of her master's command. Her hatred of the Order of the Phoenix burned hotter than ever. She despised them not only as enemies, but as symbols of everything she loathed: compassion, equality, weakness. Above all, she hated those who shared her blood yet defied her beliefs. Andromeda was still a wound in her pride, and her daughter Tonks became the focus of her rage. Bellatrix spat the name Tonks with venom, sneering at her half-blood child and her marriage to Remus Lupin, a werewolf. To Bellatrix, their union was filth upon filth, a desecration of everything sacred. Her hatred for them would spill onto the battlefield, where their encounters became both personal and vicious. As the Second War unfolded, Bellatrix reveled in her place. She was no longer a shadowy figure whispered about in the dark. She was a terror unleashed, a figure who embodied Voldemort's power. Villagers spoke of her presence as though it were a haunting. Survivors of her curses spoke of her laughter as though it had scarred them deeper than wounds. To her, this was glory. To live in the world again, to serve her master openly, to carve her name into history with fire and fear, this was the life she had always imagined. Her faith in Voldemort never wavered. Even as battles grew fiercer, even as resistance mounted, she clung to him with the certainty of one who could not conceive of defeat. She believed utterly that his triumph was inevitable, that Harry Potter and his allies were doomed. Each day, she devoted herself more fiercely, her identity bound so tightly to his that to imagine herself without him was unthinkable. She had given everything, her family, her freedom, her soul, and in return, she had the only thing she desired, a place at his side, forever loyal, forever his. The return of the Dark Lord was not simply a chapter in Bellatrix Lestrange's life. It was its climax. It was the moment when every choice she had made, every cruelty she had inflicted, every oath she had sworn, came together. She had waited in the cold and the dark, and now she burned again, a flame in the service of shadow. For Bellatrix there was no greater joy. For the world there was no greater terror. Bellatrix Lestrange lived her life at the intersection of family loyalty and absolute devotion to Voldemort, and the tension between the two often defined her choices during the Second Wizarding War. Her family was powerful, tied by blood to nearly every ancient house of note, but for Bellatrix, bloodline was never enough on its own. Blood had to be pure, untainted, and above all, obedient to the Dark Lord. Anyone who failed this test, no matter how close, became her enemy. Her sisters, Narcissa and Andromeda, represented opposite ends of this spectrum. Narcissa remained within the fold, her marriage to Lucius Malfoy ensuring that the Malfoys and the Lestranges stood side by side in Voldemort's ranks. Bellatrix adored Narcissa with a fierce protectiveness, though her protectiveness was always filtered through her devotion to Voldemort. When Narcissa wept for her son Draco, when she begged Bellatrix to intercede, Bellatrix wavered between sisterly affection and unbending loyalty to her master's will. She loved Narcissa, but Voldemort came first. Andromeda, on the other hand, represented betrayal in its purest form. By marrying Ted Tonks, a Muggle-born, Andromeda had renounced everything Bellatrix believed in. The Black family erased her name from the tapestry, but Bellatrix did not stop there. In her mind, Andromeda was not just gone, she was despised. The daughter Andromeda bore, Nymphadora Tonks, became for Bellatrix an object of hatred, the living symbol of her sister's treachery. Every time Bellatrix looked at Tonks, she saw the dilution of her sacred bloodline, and it enraged her. When war brought them face to face, Bellatrix's curses carried not only the fury of battle, but the bitterness of family betrayal. Her marriage to Rodolphus Lestrange also defined her life, though in a far different way. Their union had been arranged to strengthen pure blood ties, a duty carried out with the cold precision expected of their families. Rodolphus shared her beliefs and her devotion to Voldemort, and together they fought as comrades. But Bellatrix's heart never belonged to him. Her love, if it can be called love, was reserved entirely for Voldemort. Rodolphus was a partner in arms, a fellow fanatic, but he could never command her adoration. In this sense, their marriage was more alliance than romance, a bond forged by ideology rather than affection. Bellatrix's obsession with Voldemort set her apart even among the Death Eaters. Others feared him, respected him, or followed him for ambition. Bellatrix worshipped him. Her devotion was absolute, feverish, consuming. She sought his approval with every breath, hungered for his recognition, and bristled with jealousy whenever anyone else drew too close to him. This jealousy colored many of her relationships within Voldemort's circle. Severus Snape became a particular focus of her suspicion. She despised his calm detachment, his ability to keep secrets from her, his quiet confidence in Voldemort's trust. To Bellatrix, Snape's divided loyalties, his past as Dumbledore's spy, his complex role were intolerable. She questioned him openly, accused him of half-hearted allegiance, mocked him for his years as a teacher at Hogwarts. Yet Voldemort valued Snape, and so Bellatrix swallowed her rage, though never fully. In her eyes, Snape was a rival for the Dark Lord's favor, and she could not forgive that. Her scorn extended to Lucius Malfoy as well. She mocked him mercilessly for his caution, his careful balancing of power and reputation. When his plans failed, when the diary was destroyed, when the prophecy eluded him, Bellatrix's contempt deepened. To her, Lucius represented everything weak in the pure-blood aristocracy: pride without passion, wealth without zeal, loyalty tainted by self-interest. She ridiculed him even as Narcissa sought to protect him, creating tension within the family that only sharpened as the war progressed. Yet for all her rivalries, Bellatrix commanded respect and fear among the Death Eaters. Her zeal was unmatched, her cruelty untempered, her loyalty unquestionable. In meetings, she spoke with fire, her voice trembling with fervor as she urged others toward greater devotion. She scorned hesitation, laughed at caution, and demanded action. To stand beside Bellatrix was to feel the weight of her fanaticism pressing outward, an energy so fierce it unsettled even hardened killers. She was both inspiration and terror within the ranks. Her obsession with Voldemort blurred the line between loyalty and love. She adored him not as a leader but as something greater, something beyond human. She interpreted his words as divine, his commands as sacred. When he praised her, even slightly, she glowed with triumph. When he dismissed her, she doubled her efforts, desperate to prove herself worthy. Rumors whispered that she longed to bear his child, that her devotion was physical as well as spiritual. Whether true or not, her adoration shaped her every action. She lived for him, breathed for him, existed only to serve him. This devotion made her dangerous not only to enemies but to allies. If Voldemort commanded her to strike, she would do so without hesitation, no matter who the target might be. Her family, her comrades, even her husband, none were safe if their loyalty wavered. She measured all things against the standard of absolute faith, and by that measure, she alone was pure. It gave her strength, but it also isolated her. She was feared, respected, but rarely loved. The war gave her many chances to act upon these passions. At Malfoy Manor, she became the most volatile presence among the gathered Death Eaters. Her voice rang above the others, mocking captives, challenging allies, commanding the room with her ferocity. When Harry Potter was brought before Voldemort, Bellatrix's excitement was palpable. She longed to deliver the boy herself, to earn the Dark Lord's praise through his capture or his death. Yet again and again, fate placed Harry beyond her grasp, a frustration that deepened her frenzy. The contradictions within her grew sharper during these years. She could show tenderness toward Narcissa, yet she tortured Tonks with vicious delight. She could fight alongside Rodolphus, yet ignore him completely in the presence of Voldemort. She could laugh with joy as enemies writhed under her wand, yet rage in fury when Voldemort favored another. Her life became a storm of devotion and jealousy, cruelty and pride, love and hate. To the world outside, Bellatrix Lestrange was the face of Voldemort's terror, a witch whose very name inspired dread. To those who knew her closely, she was more complex, a sister, a wife, a rival, a zealot. But in her own mind, she was none of these. She was only what her master made her. She was his servant, his weapon, his most loyal. Family, rivalry, love, and hate, all of it existed in service to him. And so, when she strode into battle, wand raised, eyes blazing, laughter echoing, it was not Bellatrix Lestrange the world saw. It was Bellatrix, Voldemort's, forged by blood, defined by devotion, consumed by the flame of her own obsession. The Second Wizarding War unfurled across the wizarding world like a shadow spreading at dusk, and at the very heart of that darkness stood Bellatrix Lestrange. For her, the war was not a burden or a terror, but the culmination of her life's purpose. She had waited years in Azkaban, endured cold stone and the endless hunger of Dementors, all for this moment, to stand once more at her master's side, wand in hand, ready to spread his dominion across the land. Every mission, every battle, every raid was for him. Her first great triumph of this war came in the Department of Mysteries. It was there, in the labyrinth of the Ministry's hidden chambers, that Bellatrix revealed the full ferocity of her skill. She and her fellow Death Eaters had been sent to retrieve the prophecy concerning Harry Potter and the Dark Lord, a prophecy stored within the glowing spheres of the Hall of Prophecy. As the battle raged between the Death Eaters and the young members of Dumbledore's army, Bellatrix moved with savage grace. She mocked the children, laughed at their fear, and pressed them with curses too powerful for students to withstand. But the battle shifted when members of the Order of the Phoenix arrived. Duels flared, curses lit the air, and the hallways thundered with shouts and spells. In the chaos, Bellatrix faced her cousin, Sirius Black. It was a clash that carried more than just magic. It carried years of family history, of bitterness and betrayal. Bellatrix despised Sirius, the Black who had rejected his family's ideals, the cousin who had abandoned his name. For her, striking him down was not only victory but justice. Their duel ended in a single moment, as her curse sent him through the veil in the death chamber. The triumph thrilled her. She had slain a traitor, silenced a cousin she had long hated. Yet it was not only the act that gave her joy, it was the way it tied her more tightly to Voldemort. She had struck down one of Harry Potter's dearest allies, had wounded the boy in ways beyond the physical. When Voldemort himself appeared in the Ministry moments later, Bellatrix fell to her knees, overcome with joy, like a worshipper at the foot of a god. From that moment forward, her reputation was sealed. The wizarding world knew her not just as a Death Eater, but as Voldemort's most dangerous lieutenant. Newspapers whispered her name. Families spoke of her in hushed voices. To face Bellatrix Lestrange in battle was to face madness, cloaked in brilliance, cruelty dressed in laughter. As the war escalated, her presence became central. She joined raids on Muggle homes, leaving destruction in her wake. She hunted members of the Order with zeal, dueling without mercy, her laughter echoing as her enemies fell. Every act of violence was, to her, an offering to her master. She killed not for pleasure alone, but for worship. The Cruciatus Curse, her favorite, became a signature of her devotion. She wielded it as though it were an extension of her soul, pouring her rage and loyalty into its power until her victims screamed themselves into silence. The war also brought her face to face with family once more. In the halls of battle, she encountered her niece, Nymphadora Tonks. Their duels were fierce, driven by more than war. For Bellatrix, Tonks was the living symbol of betrayal, a daughter born of a sister who had defied her bloodline. She taunted Tonks, mocked her marriage to Remus Lupin, hurled curses with venom that cut deeper than words. Each clash between them carried the weight of family history, of Bellatrix's contempt and Tonks's defiance. Bellatrix's hatred found another outlet in Hermione Granger. At Malfoy Manor, when the trio was captured and dragged before her, Bellatrix's cruelty reached a peak. She saw in Hermione not only Harry Potter's ally, but a Muggle-born who dared to stand as his equal. To Bellatrix, this was intolerable. She tortured Hermione with the Cruciatus Curse, savoring each scream, demanding information, branding her with the word mudblood. For Bellatrix, this was not just torture, it was an assertion of supremacy, a declaration that the world had an order, and in that order, Hermione did not belong. The scene revealed Bellatrix at her most terrifying, elegant, composed, yet utterly merciless, her cruelty wrapped in devotion to Voldemort. Her relationships with fellow Death Eaters grew more strained during these years. She mocked Lucius Malfoy after his failures, sneered at his weakened standing, and treated him with open contempt. His hesitation disgusted her. His caution enraged her. Even within her own family's circle, Bellatrix could not tolerate what she saw as weakness. Voldemort's displeasure with the Malfoys only amplified her scorn. Despite her cruelty, Bellatrix's devotion remained her defining quality. When Voldemort grew frustrated, she sought to soothe him. When he demanded loyalty, she gave it without question. Her life narrowed into a single purpose: to serve him, to protect him, to prove her worth again and again. Her identity, her marriage, her family, all became secondary to this devotion. She was no longer simply Bellatrix Lestrange. She was Voldemort's most faithful, the witch who burned with a zeal no other could match. As the Second Wizarding War raged, her role became symbolic. To the Death Eaters, she was the ideal servant, proof of what true loyalty meant. To the Order, she was terror incarnate, a reminder of what they fought against. To Voldemort, she was his most fanatical disciple, one whose love for him bordered on madness. Every battle, every curse, every scream was, for her, a step closer to the world he promised, a world where she believed she would finally stand secure in his eternal shadow. Yet even as her victories mounted, the tide of war shifted. Harry Potter survived, again and again. The prophecy Voldemort had sought remained unfulfilled. The Order persisted, battered but unbroken. Still, Bellatrix did not doubt. Where others might have questioned, she only clung tighter, convinced that her master's triumph was inevitable. Her faith burned brighter than ever, even as the darkness around her deepened. For Bellatrix Lestrange, the Second Wizarding War was not merely history, it was the song of her life, each note composed of devotion, cruelty, and fire. She was its fiercest voice, its sharpest blade, its most terrifying echo. And though the world trembled at her name, she saw herself only as she wished to be seen, the Dark Lords, utterly and forever. The war pressed toward its climax with the inevitability of a rising tide, and Bellatrix Lestrange stood ready at its edge, her wand in hand, her heart aflame with devotion. She had lived for this, waited for it, burned for it. The final battles were not moments of fear or hesitation for her. They were the crown of her life's purpose, the stage upon which she could prove once and for all that her loyalty to Voldemort surpassed all others. When the Battle of the Seven Potters erupted, Bellatrix fought with a frenzy that seemed almost joyous. The skies thundered with curses as Order members and Death Eaters clashed among the clouds, brooms streaking through the night, green and red sparks bursting like fireworks. Bellatrix pursued her enemies with laughter on her lips, her curses sharp, her wand steady. Every spell she cast was meant not just to wound but to terrify. She dueled Tonks that night, niece against aunt, family ties erased by hatred. To Bellatrix, Tonks was no kin but filth, and the sight of her flying alongside Harry Potter only deepened her rage. Their clash was fierce, but the battle was chaotic, and neither won a final blow. Still, Bellatrix's presence was felt, her voice cutting through the storm, her laughter haunting those who survived. At Malfoy Manor, her cruelty became legendary. Captured fugitives were dragged before her, including Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Bellatrix's silver eyes glittered with suspicion and delight as she interrogated them. When she saw the sword of Gryffindor in their possession, terror flashed across her face, for she knew what it could mean. Her cruelty sharpened into desperation. She tortured Hermione mercilessly, her voice sharp with fury as she demanded answers. Her wand carved the word mudblood into Hermione's skin, an act of hatred and supremacy that revealed the depths of her obsession. To Bellatrix, Hermione represented everything she despised, a muggle-born girl who stood alongside Harry Potter, defying Voldemort's will. Torturing her was not only cruelty but vindication, yet Malfoy Manor also revealed cracks in her certainty. When Dobby the house elf appeared, freeing the captives, Bellatrix's fury turned frantic. She threw her dagger with lethal precision, striking the elf down. Dobby's death was her last act of triumph that night, but it was hollow. The prisoners escaped, and her rage at their defiance burned hotter than ever. Still, she consoled herself with the thought that the war was not yet over, that her master's victory would soon silence all defiance. The Battle of Hogwarts brought the storm to its peak. When Voldemort's forces gathered before the castle, Bellatrix stood among them like a dark flame, her eyes alight, her wand ready. The walls of the ancient school glowed with protective enchantments, defenders gathering within, but Bellatrix felt no fear. For her, Hogwarts was not a sanctuary but a stage, and the war was her performance. As the battle began, she moved through the chaos with elegance and ferocity. Her spells cut through the air, her laughter echoed among the cries, and wherever she moved, fear followed. Within the castle, she dueled with abandon. Students, professors, Aurors none were spared her fury. She reveled in the destruction, in the fire that spread through the corridors, in the clash of spells that shattered stone and glass. Yet amid the chaos, she reserved her sharpest focus for her family enemies. She dueled Tonks again, the younger witch fighting with all her strength, her wand flashing with determination. For Bellatrix, the duel was personal, a chance to erase the stain of Andromeda's betrayal. Tonks's husband, Remus Lupin, fought elsewhere, and the couple would both fall that night, though not at Bellatrix's hand. Still, the hatred between aunt and niece burned fiercely in those moments, illuminating Bellatrix's obsession with bloodline and betrayal. One of her most fearsome displays came when she conjured her Patronus rare among Death Eaters, rarer still amid the chaos of battle. The silvery hair burst forth, scattering Dementors and sending defenders reeling. The sight of her Patronus, graceful and untouchable, revealed not innocence, but the twisted strength of her devotion. She could summon joy not from love or friendship, but from her obsession with Voldemort, her pride in serving him. It was joy warped into zealotry, a reminder that even light could be wielded by the dark. But her end drew near. In the great hall, where the final duel raged, Bellatrix found herself face to face with Molly Weasley. It was a clash few expected. The fierce, seasoned Death Eater against the warm, protective mother. Bellatrix mocked her, laughter sharp, curses swift, certain of her superiority. She taunted Molly, jeering at her children, her wand moving with elegance and deadly precision. But Molly fought with a fury born of love, her determination steeled by the sight of her family threatened. Their duel blazed in the center of the hall, spells clashing like lightning, voices ringing above the din. For a moment, Bellatrix seemed untouchable. Her laughter echoed, her curses flew, her confidence gleamed, but love proved stronger than her cruelty. Molly's final spell struck true, and Bellatrix's laughter cut off in an instant. Her body fell, lifeless, her silver eyes dimmed. Silence followed, stunned and heavy, as the most feared witch in Voldemort's ranks lay motionless on the floor. Her death sent a shock through the hall. To many, it was a moment of triumph, the fall of Voldemort's fiercest servant, the end of a terror that had haunted the wizarding world for decades. To others, it was a reminder of how far devotion can twist a soul, how belief without question can consume a life. For Voldemort, it was a loss he could not ignore, though his fury at her fall was swallowed by the greater storm of his own defeat. In those final moments, Bellatrix Lestrange revealed the truth of her life. She had fought not for family, not for love, not even for herself. She had fought only for Voldemort, her master, her obsession, her reason for being. And when she fell as she had lived, devoted, fanatical, burning with a fire that consumed her until the very end. When the dust settled after the Battle of Hogwarts, the world looked upon the fallen with eyes heavy from grief and relief alike. Among the many who lay on the stone floor of the great hall was Bellatrix Lestrange, her body stilled, her wild hair fanned across the ground, her silver eyes vacant at last. For many, her death was a moment of triumph, the end of a witch whose cruelty had left scars upon countless lives. Yet for all her malice, for all her laughter in the face of suffering, Bellatrix's story did not end with her fall. Her name lingered, whispered in both fear and fascination, her legacy a reminder of what fanaticism can create. The wizarding world remembered her first as a monster. Survivors of her curses spoke of her with shudders, recalling the way her voice rose with joy when their bodies twisted in agony. Families who had lost loved ones carried her name as a wound, associating it with death and despair. The Longbottoms, broken by her hand, lived as a living testament to her cruelty. Every visit to Street, Mungo's, where Frank and Alice sat silent and lost, reminded people of the torment Bellatrix had wrought. Her name was etched into memory as one of Voldemort's most faithful, a witch who had taken pleasure in pain. But history is rarely so simple, and over time, Bellatrix came to be seen as something more than a single word of condemnation. Scholars of the war examined her fanaticism, asking how one woman could devote herself so completely to another's cause. Some argued that she was born into it, shaped from childhood by the Black family's obsession with blood purity. Others suggested that her brilliance at magic and her thirst for power made her vulnerable to Voldemort's charisma. Still others saw in her a warning that devotion, unchecked, can hollow out a person until nothing remains but the echo of another's will. For her family, Bellatrix's legacy was complicated. Narcissa carried grief, though she rarely spoke of it. She had loved her sister, even when she could not condone her actions, and Bellatrix's absence left a hollow space that could not be filled. Andromeda, who had been disowned long before, spoke little of Bellatrix, But her hatred of the Death Eaters deepened with each reminder of her sister's choices. For Tonks, who died before Bellatrix, the battle had been personal. In their duels, aunt and niece embodied the clash between love and hate, acceptance and purity, defiance and fanaticism. The Lestrange name too carried her shadow. Rodolphus survived the war, but he was broken, diminished, his wife's death leaving him without the fierce flame that had driven their family's reputation. In time, whispers of Bellatrix's rumored daughter Delphi surfaced in fragments of history and memory. Whether the story was truth or invention, it added another layer to Bellatrix's legend, the idea that her devotion to Voldemort had been so complete it might have birthed a child, a living remnant of their bond. To many, the rumor was horrifying. To others, it was simply inevitable. Among younger generations, Bellatrix became almost mythic. At Hogwarts, students whispered about her in the corridors, half fearful, half enthralled. Some wore their hair wild in imitation of her, though more as rebellion than reverence. Others swore they could still hear her laughter in the walls of the castle, a ghostly reminder of the night she fell. Teachers used her as a cautionary tale, warning students about the danger of blind loyalty, of surrendering thought to passion. And yet, in those warnings, her allure remained. For all her cruelty, Bellatrix fascinated as much as she terrified. Her place in the tapestry of the Black family became symbolic. Her name, scorched into history, was a reminder of the extremes to which the family's ideals could lead. The Black family tree, already marred by erasures and disownments, carried her story as both pride and shame. She had been the most devoted, the most faithful, the most feared, and she had fallen, defeated not by an army but by the spell of a single mother defending her child. For many, that was her true legacy, proof that even the fiercest cruelty can be undone by love. Philosophers of magic often return to Bellatrix's story when discussing the nature of power and loyalty. Some argued that she represented the seductive nature of the dark arts, how their allure lies not only in power, but in the thrill of domination. Others pointed out that her devotion to Voldemort was not rational but spiritual, a form of worship. She did not follow him for gain or fear. She followed him because she saw in him the embodiment of her truth. In this way, Bellatrix's story became a warning not only about Voldemort, but about ideology itself. When belief eclipses compassion, when devotion consumes identity, humanity fades. For Harry Potter, her legacy was more personal. Bellatrix had taken Sirius from him, casting the curse that sent his godfather through the veil. She had tortured Hermione, scarred her in ways that could not be healed. She had mocked him, taunted him, and delighted in his pain. For Harry, her death was not triumph but necessity, one step on the long path to Voldemort's defeat. Yet even he, in later years, could not deny the intensity of her loyalty. In Bellatrix, he saw the extreme opposite of what he himself embodied: devotion without love, faith without kindness, courage twisted into cruelty. For Hermione, the scars Bellatrix left were etched into memory and flesh alike. The word carved into her arm remained long after the battle, a mark of hatred that no healing spell could fully erase. And yet, in that scar lay a story of survival. Hermione's endurance became a counterpoint to Bellatrix's cruelty, a reminder that hatred may wound but cannot extinguish resilience. In wizarding culture, Bellatrix became a story told in many ways. Some remembered her as the Dark Lord's most feared lieutenant, her laughter echoing in nightmares. Others studied her as a figure of psychological fascination, a woman whose identity dissolved into another's shadow. Still others, in darker corners of society, revered her as a martyr of the old ways, a symbol of pure blood pride carried to its furthest end. The complexity of her legacy lay not in who she was, but in how she was remembered. Over time, Bellatrix's story grew softer in retelling, less sharp, more reflective. Grandparents told it to children at bedtime, not as a tale of terror, but as a warning, to guard one's heart against obsession, to protect one's mind from surrender. In these gentle retellings, Bellatrix became not a monster, but a reminder. Her life was a lantern turned dark, her flame consuming rather than illuminating. Yet even in darkness, she taught lessons worth remembering. Her life, when stretched across the tapestry of wizarding history, became a meditation on extremes. She was brilliant, talented, courageous in her way. Yet each of these qualities, untempered by compassion, became twisted. Brilliance turned to cruelty, talent turned to torment, courage turned to fanaticism. In her, one could see how gifts without kindness become weapons, how loyalty without love becomes obsession, how devotion without thought becomes destruction. And so, as the years passed, Bellatrix Lestrange endured not as a woman, but as a symbol. She was the echo of a war, the embodiment of fanaticism, the reminder of what devotion can destroy. Her name lingered in books, in whispers, in scars. To fall asleep thinking of her was to drift into a dream where laughter cuts like glass, where loyalty burns like fire, where love is twisted into worship. Yet it was also to remember that even such fire can be quenched, that even the fiercest shadow falls before the dawn.